I'm glad to be here. I'm glad there's so much interest. I'm sure that all of you before this meeting have been told about spotted lanternfly and the threat it poses. Everybody's really freaked out about it. And so I'll kind of tell you a little bit about what we've been seeing in Pennsylvania since we first got that detection and how we've been handling it. And then afterwards we'll do a little bit of an identification seminar, and I'll talk a little bit about what a plant hopper is and things like that, so you kind of have that basic entomology background if you'll ever want it. So spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. It is from China, we believe the northern part of China. And it was first found in Berks County, Pennsylvania, which is in the southeast part of Pennsylvania, in 2014. Given what we were seeing there, we think it was actually probably brought into Pennsylvania in about 2012, based on the egg masses that we were seeing. So when you look at the invasion process, again, so it started in Berks County in 2014, in 2015 in the orange, 2016 in the blue, 2017 in the green. So it's at 13 counties right now, and it still hasn't changed from that 2017 quarantine in Pennsylvania. We're really hoping it doesn't, but expecting that it will. So you can see that this is a fast invasion, but we're also still feeling pretty confident about where it is. So spotted lanternfly is also an invasive species in Korea, which is really interesting. And so there it was brought in, and within 3 years it took over the entire country. And so we're seeing that we're still being able to contain it here. And I can talk a little bit more about the control programs that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and the USDA are actually doing on the ground here in a bit. So this is the most up-to-date distribution map. So that teal colors are those same quarantine counties, and then each box is where they've surveyed. So the blue is negatives, and then the red is positive. So you can kind of see, while we have a lot of counties quarantined, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the entire county. They're just kind of at the edge, and we want to be safe, and we want to quarantine that entire county. So Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is responsible for this kind of core population. So their job is to really reduce that population there, and hopefully, make an effect in that center and just reduce the number of individuals that are leaving. The USDA is taking what Penn State calls the donut. They don't like when we call it that, so sorry. But they have basically a donut around this quarantine zone. So they're kind of at the edge here, and so they're surveying for spotted lanternfly and going in and removing populations. And I'll explain a little bit more about how they're actually going out and reducing those populations and surveying. And then throughout the rest of Pennsylvania, we have employees with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture who are going out in teams of 2 and surveying for areas we think they're probably likely to be detected. So in addition to Pennsylvania, we also have a spotted lanternfly population in Winchester, Virginia. This population is much smaller than what we're seeing in Pennsylvania, and I just found out yesterday that they've got adults. They're about 2 weeks ahead of us in terms of degree days. So this is a big grape producing region up here too, and you can also, I picked this map because it shows that nice highway connection right there. It's right along 81 is where we saw that invasion. So I think, and you'll see that kind of also with these other detections as well. So spotted lanternfly was also discovered in Delaware. Now this was a dead adult, but it was also discovered from trucking and highways, and that was at the northern part of Delaware County, or Newcastle County in Delaware. So this is southern Pennsylvania where the infestation is. So again, something that we kind of expect to see spotted lanternfly going down through here. And of course, New York. Hopefully you guys know this already, but New York also had a detection. That was in Delaware County, and so right at the border of Pennsylvania. If you look at the highway maps, you can see that this is often where a lot of truckers are coming in. So I think definitely, and I know that from even the document you showed me earlier, the plan of surveying and trying to find spotted lanternfly in New York is, yeah.
Do you know exactly where in Delaware County?
Right at the edge. Right at the edge.
Do you
but I don't.
Town or anything by chance?
I can find it for you.
Okay.
Yeah. And so again, this was a dead adult, so not a living population. There's no established population in New York as far as we know, but hopefully we'll find out more and keep an eye out on that population. And so the reason that we're all really worried about spotted lanternfly is, like many invasive species that we see come in, we have a really high population, and this high population happens to feed on over 70 different host plants, and it feeds voraciously. So it's a really interesting invasive species, actually, and I'm sure a lot of you are just interested in the biology of invasive species because it's kind of cool, right? Just having something come in and it doesn't have any natural enemies and it's able to kind of wreak havoc on a lot of things. So understanding those new interactions is really interesting. What we see with spotted lanternfly is it's just really messy. It's really complicated. So spotted lanternfly has this preferred host, Ailanthus altissima or tree of heaven. So that's a common invasive that you'll see along a lot of roadways, and we'll go out later this afternoon and look at tree of heaven. So usually when you're out in the field and looking for spotted lanternfly, if you see a tree of heaven in the quarantine zone, you're also going to find spotted lanternfly, usually in high densities. However, they also feed on over 70 plus plants. That list is continuing to grow. I'm getting emails sent from homeowners on the regular that are on their backyard roses and their peonies, and so really we're just growing this list of what they're feeding on. But what I have here is kind of this secondary preferred list, if you will. So we're really seeing them on black walnut, on hops, on grapes, on apples, and then a lot of other trees as well. So this is the kind of density that we're talking about. You may have already seen this picture, but it's really remarkable. And I hope it doesn't leave Pennsylvania, but I hope you're also able to maybe take a trip down to the quarantine zone and actually see this for yourself. I haven't seen the adults yet. Like I said, I just started in May, but I've seen nymphs at this density, and it's really remarkable to see something like this. So you'll notice that the spotted lanternfly is not feeding on the apple, it's feeding on the trunk of the tree and on the branches of the tree. So it's what we call an indirect pest. It's not directly damaging that apple, but it's taking the phloem away from the tree and away from the quality of the fruit, essentially.
I have a question. So those are all adults. There's no nymphs in that party, or there may be?
There may be. So we do see overlap, but all I see here is adults. This was taken pretty late too, really close to apple harvest. So this is likely to be all adults here. We see the same thing in grape, and we see this more often than we've seen in apple. Right now, a lot of us aren't convinced that it's going to be an apple pest, but certainly grape. I think everyone's on board with that, which is obviously really detrimental to New York because, I drove up here and there's endless wineries up here. And maybe that's not the right one. And so this is after a vineyard manager went in and put in insecticide sprays in his vineyard. And so these are all the dead bodies that you see, and you still see them feeding. And so what's really problematic with spotted lanternfly is it's easy to kill, which is kind of the funny thing about it. You can throw a lot of different insecticides at it. Ones that they're kind of considered joke insecticides because they only work with some things and they're really friendly to the environment. They never work, but in this case they actually do, which is awesome. But the problem is that spotted lanternfly populations are so high that it doesn't really matter what you spray in the vineyard because they just come back in. So we just have this continuous feeding population. And so growers have a really hard time actually managing because they need to be spraying every 5 to 7 days, but then they also need to be thinking about harvest. And so when you're spraying an insecticide, you have to make sure that you're with the pre-harvest interval for the insecticide. So they can, in some cases, need to be 7 to 14 days out without spraying before they can harvest their grapes. So this is really problematic, and what we're seeing is reduced grape quality. What we're also seeing is sooty mold, and that's happening from the honeydew excretion. So if you watch these guys feed, you can kind of notice that every once in a while you'll see little drops coming down, looks like rain, from their butts. And what they're actually doing, because they're phloem feeders, they have a piercing sucking mouth part, and that's tapping into the plant, into the phloem. So you can kind of see him shooting out that honeydew there. What's happening is that spotted lanternfly doesn't, it's feeding on a lot of sucrose basically in that plant. It doesn't really want that. It wants the nutrients that are in the plant. So it ends up accumulating all of this sugar water, and it's just going to excrete that out. So they feed really voraciously, like I said, and we have high populations here. So what you end up with is extreme accumulation of that honeydew on the leaves there. And so you can see, again, it's just flicking it out. So this is what that looks like in grape and a lot of other plants that they're feeding on, is you just get this sooty mold covering. Sooty mold is a mix of different bacteria and fungi that basically are feeding on that sucrose solution, but what that's doing is acting as a leaf block for the plant. So not only are you getting nutrients and sucrose taken out of the plant, but those leaves are also unable to photosynthesize and increase the sugar in that Brix, or the sugar in the grapes. And that's really bad, because what a grape grower depends on is having high sugar in their grapes so they can have great wine and great grape juice as well. And so we're also seeing this in a lot of other areas as well, so in backyards. So this is a woman who had spotted lanternfly feeding on above her deck and above her house in some tree heaven above her area. And she had so much honeydew and so much sooty mold growth that she had to power wash. And this is the bottom step that was power washed, and you can see she still couldn't get all of that sooty mold out. So this is really, it's kind of like a brown membraneed stink bug problem, where you have the nuisance, you have the crop damage. It really extends above a lot of different industries. So again, you have densities like this, and here's a little toy car for a kid. And so parents don't want their kid playing out in their yard, but then you also see again these shiny leaves. That's all that honeydew. So with the sooty mold, we're seeing death of understory plants. But we're also just seeing gross stuff that people just don't want to be out, drinking a glass of wine on their porch and getting rained on with, insect poo.
So what is all that sawdust coming on the tree? Is that just a dead tree?
Yeah, it looks like it might have been a porcupine tree.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a good question. I don't think that's related to spotted lanternfly.
Okay.
So again, I mentioned that homeowners are reporting damage to berry and vegetable crops. So we have some basil here, some blueberry, and we also had horseradish, cucumber. I'm not still convinced that we're going to see economic damage from these crops, so I wouldn't raise alarms at this point on these types of crops, on vegetable crops and some berry crops. However, what we're seeing is those early instars have a really large host range. Adults seem to kind of prefer, at least when they first transition into adulthood, they seem to prefer that tree of heaven, and then afterwards they'll kind of feed on what they've got. But these guys in particular seem really prolificous, so they'll feed on what they've got, and even things that we didn't think would be a host. So for instance, I was just out in the field and I saw some nymphs feeding on white pine. We didn't think that pine was going to be a host for them, but there they are feeding on it. So they really can take anything, which means that they can be sustained until they get an ideal host. So again, I think that means we're going to get a lot of reports of them feeding on something that they might not cause a lot of damage to unless you're seeing extremely high populations, which we are. So in terms of damage to the plant, we're seeing oozing from the trees. It kind of depends on the tree, but tree of heaven especially. Just this year, we're starting to see oozing from maple as well, and we're not sure what's going on there, but somehow those trees are producing some fungus and some oozing. We're also seeing leaf curl, wilting, flagging of trees, so those branches will die off. And I've seen a lot of death of trees. Most of this is tree of heaven, but you're talking 70-foot trees that are dead because they were so densely feeded on by spotted lanternfly. Where you saw yield losses in apple and in grape. In apple, it's mostly confined to 2 farms that saw yield losses. In grape, it's many more than that. As far as we understand, they cannot transmit pathogens, but we don't know, especially when we're talking, if you know anything about apples and fire blight, we know that fire blight can be transmitted really easily, for instance, by bees, and so we think that spotted lanternfly is probably able of carrying that pathogen. And then sooty mold, again, is a big issue, especially for grape growers and trying to get their sugar concentration up in their grapes. So when we think about it in Pennsylvania, forestry products is a huge industry for us. We're the largest timber producer in the U.S. And then we also have grapes, apples, peaches, and then ornamental crops. And so, again, this spans across a lot of different industries, and so that's one of the issues, is how do you communicate this problem to all of these industries, especially some that aren't organized very well, for instance, the nursery and landscape. Nursery is fairly well organized, but landscape is kind of a mess. They don't have organizations that you can really go to and talk to them about their spotted lanternfly problem. And then we also have issues with property values. So people trying to sell their house and they've got honeydew coming down for people coming to look at the house and nobody wants to buy that, right? And tourism and just thinking about the overall health of the ecosystem, as you all probably already know. So because of all these issues, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture has issued a quarantine for spotted lanternfly in those 13 counties. So what that means is that anyone who finds a spotted lanternfly cannot transport it, but they also are required to destroy it if they're able to. What that means, also on a broader sense, is that businesses are, and especially truckers and thinking about transportation, are being held accountable for making sure that they don't have spotted lanternfly that they're carrying with them. So now we have spotted lanternfly permits. Initially they started out as compliance agreements that became too complicated because of the process. This permitting system is a lot easier. It's a free permit, and so what it means is that any business that is involved in the transport of materials within the quarantine zone or in and out of the quarantine zone is required to have a permit. So that includes, companies that are in New York that are delivering to wineries, delivering wine bottles down in the quarantine zone. That includes a donut delivery driver who's going back and forth through the quarantine zone. So again, this is a lot of industries that are affected, and it's hard to communicate this message to all of those folks. But again, it's a free permit. It's something you can either do in person and take a short exam or do online. And we're really trying to push this more and more. And then Penn State is also creating online courses that are industry specific to what you can do to check for spotted lanternfly. So that's really important, especially thinking about the truckers and what they can do to look under their vehicle and make sure there are no egg masses, etc.
How's that working so far? Do you know?
Well, it kind of just started right before I took the job, and so I think it's okay.
Because it's like teaching someone better management practices, so you just hope for the best.
Exactly, yeah. And so we are meeting with industry panel members to come up with best management practices and put that into the permitting system as requirements. For instance, for truckers, there's certain areas on their truck they're supposed to check. They need to carry a spray bottle with them in plastic bags along with scraper cards to remove egg masses and then spray a chemical on them and then be able to tie them up, smash them, and throw them out. So we have this best management practices in place so that they actually know what to do. The issue with the permit is just getting people aware of it, I think. Because there's people who don't work in the agricultural sector at all who would never pay attention to something like this. So it's really been difficult to target that group and make them aware of this. For Pennsylvania residents, we have a reporting system. So we actually have a call center, which to me just sounds crazy. Why would you need a call center for an invasive species? But it's actually been really great. It's just been up and running for a few weeks now, and we get about 60 calls a day on average. And most of those are help and management, but hopefully some of those will be reporting. So we're really encouraging people that are outside of the quarantine zone to call and report. As soon as that report is verified, we send USDA and PDA out to check it out, and then ideally they'll eradicate that small satellite population is kind of the approach that we've been taking. We're asking people to collect the specimen or take a good picture of it. If you guys work with the public, you know that there's a lot of misidentified specimen. So somebody sees something on the news and they're like, oh, that's the problem I have in my backyard. And they call me and they're convinced and they've got it, and then they finally send me a picture and it's blue bottlefly, for instance, which happened. And so it's definitely important to get a good picture of it. So I think if you guys are out there interacting with the public and they see something that's spotted lanternfly, I would definitely request a picture and then also a sample. And then we also have online reporting, which can be used by any state, and that's really user-friendly. So you just kind of fill out a form, and you can upload a photo and talk about where you saw it.
Can I ask you,
Mm-hmm.
we have New York IMAP invasives here, so we're having people, make observations of tree of heaven right now. That's kind of what New York is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys suggest people use Pennsylvania IMAP for this, or no, for spotted lanternfly?
To detect?
To make observations.
A tree of heaven or spotted lanternfly?
Both. IMAP invasives, you don't know?
That's a good question. So Spotted Lanternfly, we want them all to report here.
This way, yeah.
Tree of Heaven.
Heather,
Yeah.
I was on the IMAP Invasive the other day, and
Yeah.
they do have Tree of Heaven in Pennsylvania and New York. And when I looked at Spotted Lanternfly, there was nothing for New York, and it didn't show anything in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so we're really not encouraging people with Spotted Lanternfly to report there, but Tree of Heaven, even we haven't been encouraging people to report. I think part of that is because you just start driving around and you realize how much Tree of Heaven there is. And so I don't know how helpful that would be, but that could be an approach we take if we want to look at populations. So quickly going through the management steps that we're telling folks to do if they have Spotted Lanternfly. One being stop the spread, scrape eggs, you can ban the trees, and we'll do a demo of that later. Remove Tree of Heaven, and apply insecticides. So stop the spread is really important. So we already saw that curve that Hillary presented, and so you guys right now are at the better stage than what we're at. And so if you can stop the spread and increase detection, then you're sitting pretty compared to where Pennsylvania is at right now. So we're really pushing to stop the spread even within the quarantine zone. You know, people love to camp. We're worried about football games and people coming up for the football games from the quarantine zone. So we're trying to make it people a lot more aware, basically. So there are a lot of different communication programs that we have out there in collaboration with USDA and PDA to try to push this message more and more. So some things that people might not think about, buying a grill on Craigslist in the quarantine zone. That was a situation where it came up and there were egg masses on the inside of the grill. So I'll talk a little bit more about Spotted Lanternfly and where they lay eggs, but basically they lay eggs on anything that's hard. So this is an issue. This is a really big issue when you think about rail cars, for instance, that are out there sitting ready to be loaded up, and you've got pregnant spotted lanternflies feeding all along those railways where Tree of Heaven tends to grow. It's kind of a recipe for disaster. So we're really, again, trying to push that awareness, because I think this is the stage that we're most worried about, that and spreading pregnant females as well. But this is really scary when you think about these egg masses that are absolutely everywhere. So I almost guarantee you go into the quarantine zone in that core-infested area, you start going to people's backyards and looking under their picnic tables or on the sills of their windows, and you'll find egg masses.
Wow.
So again, this is a message that Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is also pushing, so that look before you leave. Again, really trying to put that awareness out there. The second step is if you have an infestation, you could scrape the eggs. So Spotted Lanternfly lays eggs in October to November, and then they don't hatch until about May. So you've got a nice chunk of time to go out and survey for egg masses and scrape those off. So you can use a lot of different tools to do that and put it into a bottle or a bag and then toss it into isopropyl alcohol or smash them. We have a lot of master gardeners in Pennsylvania who are really engaged in the Spotted Lanternfly program, and they're coming up with all sorts of ways to kill these eggs and the nymphs in almost sadistic, worrying ways. But yeah, so they've experimented with burning them and different household chemicals and things like that, which I don't encourage, but they're very enthusiastic about it. We also have banding trees to catch the nymphs. So Spotted Lanternfly nymphs and adults, but especially the nymphs, will go up and down the trees, mostly up, and then they'll fall down and then they'll go back up. So we'll take advantage of that behavior by banding the trees and trapping them in that. And why we can catch adults using this method, and it's a good monitoring tool, especially for New York to be using. But the problem is that they just are a lot stronger in their ability to walk and fly and jump, and so usually we just don't get the catch that we want to with the adults. The other thing with these banding tapes, there's a lot of different things you can use. So there's commercial things that you can go pick up at TSC or Home Depot or wherever. You can also use duct tape that's wrapped to the tree, sticky side out, so it's a good cheap fix. The problem is the stickier that it is, the more non-targets you get. So there are non-target insects that are captured. And there's also, in some cases, been some small mammals and birds that have been trapped. Really rare, but we have seen, bats and woodpeckers and some other things on that. So that's something that people get very upset about, and so you just want to be aware of that. We're telling folks to check their bands about once a week to kind of be aware of what might get stuck, and then also be aware of how you're going to respond if you have, you know, a live bat stuck to one of these bands. So this isn't even really a bad picture. It's the best one that I could find. But you go to some of these sites and the whole sticky trap, you know, you just see them crawling over the dead bodies, and then they get to the new sticky area at the top. So in really dense populations, you want to change these bands really regularly. But I think this probably does have hopefully some impact on the population, or at least can help protect some trees. So if a homeowner really likes their willow out back, then they can maybe protect that from the nymphs. When you get to the adult stage, originally it was reported that spotted lanternfly can't fly. They just jump. They're a plant hopper, but then we saw some intense flying behavior. They're not great flyers. They're not like a bee or even a butterfly, but they're really good at gliding. And what we're finding is that they'll jump off of things and just glide to the next tree. So locomotion for them is not an issue. It's, you know, we don't need to rely on them not flying. They definitely are capable of moving long distances. And so I think the really tricky part, again, with dealing with spotted lanternfly, people are used to, you know, kind of a short-lived pest that you put on a couple of sprays for in agriculture, or, you know, homeowners have their fixes that they can do. This is not that problem. This is a year-long problem where you need to check for egg masses, you need to kill the nymphs, you need to make sure there are no adults on your property, and if you are, then use insecticides if you're determined to get rid of them. You know, and also I think it's a community effort, so talking to your neighbors. We have a lot of people who are really upset because their neighbors aren't doing anything for spotted lanternfly control, and we're getting, you know, honeydew rained on our porch because of their tree, for instance. And so that's been a big issue for us, is trying to just navigate homeowners and make sure that they're friendly with their neighbors, but also sharing the problem about spotted lanternfly. Another thing that we've recommended for folks to do, and that Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is doing, is removing Tree of Heaven. Tree of Heaven is difficult to remove. Like I said, it's an invasive. A lot of you probably already know that. It's kind of a pain in the butt because it has suckers, it produces suckers, and if you don't put herbicide on in the right period of its life stage, or in the right period of the season, then you're just going to make the problem way worse. I don't have the picture here, but we have a person who does almost exclusively Tree of Heaven control at Penn State, and he went to a stand that somebody had improperly removed one Tree of Heaven, and then he went back 2 years later and he's standing in a thicket of them. And so it's a plant that's hard to remove. You know, you can kill it with 2 different herbicides that you might be already familiar with, is glyphosate and triclopyr. And depending on, you know, the habitat you're in, you don't want to use triclopyr for any grape growers because that's really volatile and will damage the grape. Glyphosate is good for grape, or well better. So anyway, removing Tree of Heaven is an approach that people might be able to take. The USDA is not removing Tree of Heaven because, that's a big task to remove Tree of Heaven in this large area. So they're just going out and treating Tree of Heaven, which I'll talk about in a minute. Because we have an invasive species that feeds on so many different hosts, removing Tree of Heaven might help reduce the pest pressure in that area locally, but they're just going to go to the black walnut that's there, the willow that's there, the wild grape. Yeah?
Yeah, that's a question I have. As far as Tree of Heaven goes, is without Tree of Heaven in the area, can there be a population that reproduces, or?
It's a really important question, and the short answer is we don't have the complete answer. My guess is that they do not need Tree of Heaven. So it's been really contentious to talk about this to some of the scientists because there's different opinions on this. So the study that was done was rearing spotted lanternfly from egg hatch all the way to adulthood. The plan was to bring those adults through the winter and then have them lay eggs, so we could actually see if they're, you know, able to lay eggs on that one host, or from, you know, just feeding on that one host. And what we saw is that black walnut, hops, grape, and Tree of Heaven all produce spotted lanternfly adults just fine from egg to adults. However, they all died once they reached the adult stage, including the ones from Tree of Heaven. So we don't know whether or not they need Tree of Heaven to be able to produce viable eggs. So it's kind of tricky. We don't, we still don't know the complete answer, but we at least know that they're able to complete their life cycle on other hosts. So that's why I think tree of heaven removal, and given that it's so invasive, it just might not be the answer. But if people want to go out and spend their time removing it, it's an invasive species, so that's great. So, did you have another question in the back?
It was similar.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tree of heaven ID, we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later when we go back there. So I won't focus on this too much. Talking about insecticide options, one of the handouts I have is this management for homeowners. It includes insecticide recommendations that homeowners can use. Unfortunately, we're still working on data to back these insecticide recommendations up, but a lot of these are commonly used insecticides that homeowners have access to. And as I mentioned, spotted lanternfly is really susceptible to a lot of different insecticides, so it's kind of a long list if you look through that. So there's organic options, and then there's also the really traditional options like Sevin. A lot of people will grab that from their hardware store. And so briefly, what the Pennsylvania Department of Ag and USDA are doing is the trap tree method. So we're using the insecticide with the AI dinoteffuran to inject into tree of heaven, and this works really, really well. So what the PDA is doing is going out and removing the majority of tree of heaven with herbicide, and then they leave just a couple and treat those with that systemic pesticide. So that brings all the spotted lanternfly in and then kills them. I should have included a picture here, but you see these treated trees that literally you can put a meter stick in because there's so many spotted lanternflies that have been killed by that. So the PDA is really optimistic that this is helping to reduce populations. In the core zone where we first saw spotted lanternfly, there have been anecdotal reports that it seems lower this year. There's not as many nymphs around, and so it seems reduced. Unfortunately, outside of that immediate zone, especially to the south, we're getting reports of really, really dense infestations like we did last year. So whether or not this is working or it's just kind of a moving front, we're not really sure. And then the USDA is using the same method of injecting dinoteffuran into these tree of heaven, but they're not removing the other surrounding tree of heavens.
Heather?
Yeah.
Was that an issue of picking that particular insecticide? Because that one certainly has been heavily implicated in pollinator kills. So how did that get balanced with picking that as the chosen insecticide?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the reason that dinoteffuran kind of first came about was because it was reported on in a Korean study that it worked and killed spotted lanternfly. So that's sort of where PDA started, and it worked really well, and so they kind of just kept going with that. We haven't done any non-target assessments yet. We're trying, this year we kind of missed tree of heaven bloom, but we're trying to understand what pollinators are actually going to tree of heaven. The other insecticides that you can use as a systemic in tree of heaven are things that they're not much better for other reasons. So imidacloprid, for instance, has a lot of activity in the soil, so if you're applying that as a drench, it works well for controlling spotted lanternfly, but it's able to get into the groundwater really easily from other studies as far as we understand. If you're applying imidacloprid as an injection, for whatever reason, it's not being taken up into the trees where you want it to be, and so it's not working as well. So I think dinoteffuran is a good solution for now, but we are really trying to understand the non-target effects there as well. Yeah, Rick?
Do you know if any work has been done targeting eggs on the tree trunks using horticultural mineral oil that they use against eggs or other
Yeah, Greg Krawczyk, who you probably know, is working on that, and he has found one chemical that will kill spotted lanternfly egg masses, and that's chlorate pyrophos, and no other mineral oil, horticultural oil does not work, as far as we understand. Talking about biological control, a lot of people have this question of, oh, isn't there something feeding on them? So we have some natural enemies here that are generalist predators that are feeding on spotted lanternflies. So you've got spiders and wheelbugs and praying mantises. So this is great, it's great to see that, and I think it's great for a homeowner to boost the natural enemy abundance in their backyard. This isn't going to control the population by any means, though. I think we all kind of know that. When we talk about bird predators, spotted lanternfly is toxic. And I can't really clarify that beyond that statement. So we know that birds who eat spotted lanternfly vomit. There have been reports of dogs consuming the spotted lanternfly and vomiting as well. In Korean studies, they found the compound cantharidin, which is found in blister beetles, so you'll see that a lot. Horses are really sensitive to cantharidin, so you want to make sure there's no blister beetles in hay bales and things like that. So Korea found cantharidin. However, when we looked for cantharidin in our populations here, we didn't find any. So we're not sure what toxic compound is causing this, and whether or not we need to worry about spotted lanternfly being in forage crops and damage to horses. That's kind of still ongoing, but we do believe that they're toxic in some way.
Alive or dead? I mean, both?
I would say both, yeah. Yep. A cool finding is that the parasitoid that was, one of the parasitoids that was released to control gypsy moth actually attacks spotted lanternfly egg masses, which is awesome. But again, and so this is a paper that was studied, or a paper that was published on this. But what we're finding is parasitoid levels are about 2% of the population, so really low, and they seem just in certain areas of Pennsylvania. So we're doing more research on this, but what we really need is classical biological control in this situation. So we are working with USDA ARS, which they've got a great biological control program. Kim Holmer is leading that, and he's already been over to China a couple of times to look for natural enemies of spotted lanternfly. That is something that takes a really long time because we need to understand the non-target effects of a parasitoid or a predator before we release it into the U.S. So that's something that we're hopeful about, but again, that's 5 to 10 years down the road. And I thought I would throw a Cornell thing in here. So Ann Hayek works at Cornell, and she does a lot of work with fungi attacking insects. So she's worked a lot with gypsy moth and a lot of other important insects. She's looking at Bovaria batsiana, which is a common fungus that attacks many insects, to control spotted lanternfly. So here's that fungus growing on spotted lanternfly in the field here. So we're seeing that in the fields, again at pretty low levels, but we're trying to understand if there's ways that we can boost that. And there's a lot of research that I didn't mention, and I'm happy to talk about more. What we're doing this summer is looking at short and long-term effects of spotted lanternfly on a lot of these different hosts that we're worried about, especially those agricultural crops. We're also looking at insecticide recommendations for homeowners, for grape growers, and for peach growers, so that's ongoing. We're trying to understand a little bit more about the saliva and the feeding. It's really interesting when you see spotted lanternfly feed. They've got a whole tree to feed on, but what they're doing is clustering in one area. And they'll actually spend time fighting over a feeding site, so you'll see them just kind of kick at each other. And so we have no idea why that's happening. Why are they picking that feeding site over the whole rest of the tree? Our best guess is that there's something going on with their saliva, and that it's able to kind of change the tree, make it easier to feed, and that feeding site becomes very desirable. But we're still working on some studies there. We are trying to develop lures and attractants. We have one that we're using now, but it doesn't work, so not super helpful in terms of monitoring. But as soon as we get something there, I think that will really boost our monitoring program in states that don't yet have spotted lanternfly. We're also trying to understand communication of adult spotted lanternfly and nymphs. We have not found any pheromones, so we don't think pheromone disruption is going to be involved in terms of management. However, they do basically tap, so they communicate by vibrations, and so we're trying to characterize that a little bit more and understand if we can either draw them in with that or repel them with that. And then host requirements and preferences, so back to that tree of heaven question, do they actually need tree of heaven to produce viable egg masses? We're not sure. And then I mentioned foreign exploration for those natural enemies. So there's a lot of different universities here, and many that I didn't put up, that are getting more and more involved in spotted lanternfly, and so that's great. We're really glad to have some research going on. And then this is just a message that you can go to our Penn State website and sign up for newsletter alerts on spotted lanternfly, but then we also have a Twitter @StopSLF. And that'll kind of give you an idea of what we're doing out in the field and some of the things we're finding. And then there's a lot of folks that aren't included in this that have done awesome work so far on spotted lanternfly, and we're excited for the research we're going to get this year and beyond as well. You might have already taken a look at them. It's a fairly striking insect. It's pretty easy to identify. You see it and you're like, yeah, not many other things look like that. So that's the nice thing, is that it's pretty easy to identify. So spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper. It was originally called lanternfly because the describer, Linnaeus, heard from somebody else that they bioluminesce in some other species that I'll talk about a little bit later. That's false. They don't produce any lighting at all, but they still are called that, so that's a misnomer. They are spotted, so at least we've got one. And they do fly, I guess, you know, but yeah, officially they're a plant hopper. That's in the hemipteran group, so I'll talk about what that means in a little bit, but basically that means piercing, sucking mouth parts. And then they're in the plant hopper clade, along with leafhoppers and cicadas. And within that, they're within the fulgorid family, and then this is their species name, Lycorma delicatula. So let's just talk about what a hemipteran is first. So other hemipterans are cicadas, brown marmorated stink bug, aphids, and leafhoppers. So what they all have in common, again, is that piercing, sucking mouth part. You can see that here on a spotted lanternfly that's kind of upside down. We call this the beak. And what it is basically is fusing of all these different mouth parts. So when you think about a beetle or a caterpillar, they're chewing mouth parts, right? You can kind of picture them chewing on that leaf. These guys, their mandible and their labium and maxilla are all fused together. And most have two tubes within that stylet or that beak. One is excreting basically compounds that make it easier to feed. So I kind of already talked about that. It makes it easier for them to go into that phloem, dissolve that phloem a little bit. And then the second tube is what's actually bringing that food back up into them. So when they're feeding, part of their mouth parts kind of stay outside. So when you see them feeding, you'll see kind of this like little elbow shape. And what that means is that the rest of their stylet is within the plant and feeding into that phloem. So fulgorids are plant hoppers again. And what's really interesting about this whole spotted lanternfly dilemma, if you will, is that fulgoridae is considered a prize for insect collectors. Because, I mean, look at these insects. They're absolutely gorgeous. And they're large, too. They're really big. They're tropical species. They've got these cool head processes. This one's called the peanut-headed bug. So they're just really cool insects. And so spotted lanternfly is just very unique in the fact that it's a pest, it's an invasive species, and we have the abundance that we do now. So when we look at all other fulgorids, so closely related in that same family in the US, this is kind of faded out, but really we don't have very many, especially in our region. The highest diversity is in southwest US. But again, we're talking about 7 species, 6 species. We have 18 known species in North America. So diversity is really low here. So it's interesting because I work with Dr. Julie Urban, who's kind of known as one of the fulgorid experts in the US. She's at Penn State, she's handling a lot of the spotted lanternfly issue and doing a lot of research. But she's a fulgorid specialist and has traveled all over the world to collect these really cool fulgorids. And all of a sudden, here comes one on her doorstep that's an invasive species. So at first she was kind of in heaven, right? Because there's this cool exotic fulgorid. But then we quickly realized that it was a big issue. So there's about 568 species of fulgorids, so it's a fairly small family. And again, only one is a known pest. So it's really interesting that spotted lanternfly is very unique. Another thing that's kind of different about spotted lanternfly, all other species of fulgorids that are known have 5 nymphal instars in an adult. Spotted lanternfly has 4 nymphal instars in an adult. So they're just different in a lot of ways, and we don't really understand why. Julie Urban is working on the genetics and trying to understand the evolutionary history of them, and so we're still trying to learn a lot more, but they're just very unusual. And other fulgurids are found on woody host plants. So like spotted lanternfly, they'll be feeding on trees and other woody things. This is just to give you an idea of the fulgurids that we have in the U.S. So there's a Cornell drawer in the back there, and you can kind of see the different ones. The ones that we have in the U.S. are, of course, kind of boring. They're a little bit brown, but they do have cool head processes. But diversity isn't what like you see in say, Borneo, for instance. So spotted lanternfly, again, is very unique. So briefly, I'll walk through some ID characteristics that you would use if you had a bunch of plant hoppers in front of you. How is fulgurid different? So it's all about the tarsi. It's all about the legs on fulgurids. So if you know anything about insect ID, these are the second tarsi, and what you're looking at here are on the first tarsomere, you have a little projection on some, and then those have spines on each of them, and then here we have a smooth without any spines. So if they have these spines, those are delphacids. That's a really common plant hopper group that we have all throughout New York and the rest of the U.S. If they're smooth, that means there's something else. So you kind of move forward and look at that. And then you look at the tarsi additionally, and you see if they have two spines on this kind of hump here, or if they're spined all throughout. So if they're spined all throughout, you're even getting closer to fulgurids. And I'm kind of walking you through this quickly, but if you want to look at the specimen in the back and try to look at their tarsi and try to find those characteristics, it's just good to know how to classify a fulgurid. And then the last thing that leads it to a fulgurid is the fact that they have these cross veins. So that's really nice and easy. So you don't see that everywhere else you see that these veins are kind of complete. Here you see a lot of cross veins. That's really obvious with spotted lanternflies. Briefly, male versus female is also really easy. So the structure just looks completely different. Unfortunately, everything I have in the back is female because that's what what's really easy to collect. And I hope you'll go in the back and see the differences between, I put two females in each of the petri dishes. One has a really yellow abdomen and it's much bigger, and then one doesn't have that yet. The kind of classic picture of spotted lanternfly that I put in the beginning is with all its wings spread out and has this bright yellow abdomen. Most of the year you're not going to see that bright yellow abdomen. That's just when the females are pregnant and have lots of eggs in there, and you'll see that in the back is how large they get. When they get to that point, they're very lazy. They can barely move. You kind of feel bad for the females looking at them. So they, and I didn't mention this, but they lay about 2 egg masses. Each egg mass has 30 to 50 eggs in it. So a female is capable of laying 100 offspring approximately. So anyway, so females kind of have this structure here, and then males have a flattened and kind of reduced structure. So talking again about the life cycle, so you can look at the Eureka mounts as I kind of talk through this. There's an example of the egg masses in there, and there's a ton of egg masses in the back that I can show you that you can kind of see in person. So again, 30 to 50 eggs per egg mass, and they're laid in rows. They kind of look like seeds, and you'll notice that in some of the ones in the back. After the female lays those eggs, she then puts a waxy covering over them. We're still not really sure what the purpose of the waxy covering is. Probably protection from winter conditions. However, it seems like in Pennsylvania, there are some that have not been covered just because the female did a bad job, and some that have been covered, and we see hatch from both of them. So we're still not really sure what's going on there. When the egg mass is first laid, it looks really glossy, and then throughout the summer as it ages, it starts to look like cracked mud. And again, you'll see so I see more of that cracked mud appearance. And so again, they lay in October and November, and then you start to see first hatch in May. So they go through 3 nymphal instars that look basically identical to this. Again, you can see that Riker mount, they all look the same, they're just slightly larger. So size is really what we're going for. If you want to be official about it and determine the instar, you can measure the distance between their 2 eyes and determine the nymphal instar that way. And their 4th instar, they radically change, and we are getting these now in Pennsylvania. They're really iridescent red, and both of these are very, very iridescent, so it's hard to miss them. The white is very, very white, and again here the white and the red is very, very white and red. And so they're about ½ an inch. When these guys start out in the first instars, a lot of people say they look like ticks. They kind of crawl like ticks. They kind of have that body form. And so a lot of people might mistake these for ticks. And then we'll get to the adults. The adults in Pennsylvania emerge in, probably this year, it'll be late July. I mentioned that Virginia population already has adults emerging, and we're about 2 weeks behind them on degree days, so we're thinking that's probably when they're going to emerge. In New York, it would probably be a little bit later, I would guess, but it's hard to say. Usually they're with their wings closed. I mentioned that they can fly and they do kind of do this gliding behavior, but usually they're not going to put their wings open unless they're startled or unless they're kind of hopping away. So I'm really trying to encourage people when we talk about outreach and spotted lanternfly is to use an image that looks more like this and not this one, just because you might not see that bright red showing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So that letter D there, the adult with the wings closed, can you tell the difference between a male and a female just by looking at the insect? Or do you have to really see them all apart? You
really have to look at the genitalia and turn them over to see. Okay. The only time you can immediately tell the difference is when that female's already enlarged and pregnant. Yeah.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
The egg mass and the little Riker mouse, is that pretty much the size of like what an egg mass looks like?
About, let me see, I think it's at the end here. So you can kind of see this is, yeah, so a lot of egg masses.
It looks like gypsy moth almost.
Yeah, it does look very similar to gypsy moth. Is a little bit more orangey and a little bit more fibrous. But these are like kind of like mud smearings is what I think they look like. But they're about an inch long. So some of those might be just kind of cut small pieces.
But they're not,
so yeah, going back to the first through third instars, this is, again, they're pretty obvious. There's a fourth instar hanging out there, so don't look at him. But they're pretty obvious, and you'll see them mostly feeding on softer tissue. So on this grapevine, they're feeding on the new growth. They're not feeding on the woody parts. This is probably because their stylet just isn't strong enough. Their mouth parts just aren't strong enough to penetrate the wood, but we're not sure. Fourth instars, then you start to see that they'll move to that woodier tissue. Again, they're really striking, and you can see that they'll be clustered around this tree, and they're bright red. So we're getting a lot more calls now in the past week because these are a lot more obvious than those other ones, and they're also quite a bit bigger. And then here we have some adults too. When we talk about overlap of these different life stages, what we see with egg hatch is that it starts in May and is ending about now. So most of them are hatching earlier, but we do see a strong overlap of different life stages. So I was just out in the field because we had to collect 2,000 of these to do an insecticide trial. I found a few first instars, I found a few second instars, mostly thirds, and then some fourths. So we're really seeing all of them kind of overlap. So you'll see that, especially this time of year. It's not until about late August, early September that you should be seeing only adults.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So they overwinter, the egg masses overwinter. So because of climate change, and not having such long or cold winters, would that maybe affect the populations in a negative,
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I guess I can back up to some of the Korean literature. So what they did in Korea is to try to look at what temperature spotted lanternfly egg masses would survive to. And what they found, I can't remember the exact number, but they basically were like, yeah, they can't really survive winters with so many days below 10 degrees Celsius, for instance. And so we applied that to the United States, applied that mapping and looked at the distribution and looked at what Pennsylvania conditions were. And we're like, okay, that's great. Spotted lanternfly is going to die this winter. Like we've met these requirements. That's great. And I don't think I've ever seen a healthier population of spotted lanternfly. So I think the literature in Korea is a mismatch from what we're seeing in the U.S. We don't know why that is, but a lot of it we've honestly just had to throw out because what they see. We've had a researcher that went over there and shared some videos of their kind of swarming behavior and flying above above the apple trees that we saw last year. We showed that to some Korean entomologists who work on spotted lanternfly, and they said, we've never seen anything like that. So for some reason, there's some differences, and it could just be that, you know, behavior, whatever their circumstances are just different, but we're really not sure. And then we see the adults, so again, we get dense aggregations. This is kind of what I was talking about, where these insects will spend a lot of time fighting over these spots to feed, when they could go up here and feed on these other parts of the tree. So we think there's something going on, again, probably with their saliva and their messaging and changing the way that the tree is producing phloem, basically. And then underneath these adults, you can kind of see black. That's that sooty mold. And then here's an egg-laying female, and you can see her secreting that covering. So again, once she secretes it, it's kind of like marshmallow fluff. That's a really weird way to describe it, but that's kind of what it looks like, and then it starts to age. And then again, this egg mass photo. So at this point in the winter, it's kind of looking like that smeared mud. And if each of these egg masses contains roughly 50 eggs, I think telling somebody to go and scrape these egg masses off will have an effect on at least that local population. What we're seeing with grape producers, it's difficult because spotted lanternfly really likes to lay eggs on the underneath of the vine, and they blend in really well with grapevines. So it's difficult to see them, but we are seeing that they're, if they're going out, they're pruning their grapes in the winter, they're also scraping those egg masses. Where we saw spotted lanternfly, you can look under the vine and say, oh yeah, they missed an egg mass right here. So we are seeing that, local reduced population there. Kind of what I was talking about, the aging of the covering. See, she missed some of the covering here, but so in November it looks about this, and then that same egg mass in March looks like this. They do degrade over time.
Now, will those eggs be viable that she did not cover?
Yes, they were. So. And then the last thing I wanted to cover is some of the things that I get that people are like, I found a spotted lanternfly. Not quite. So a lot of moths are often mistaken for spotted lanternfly. I mean, it's very moth-like, especially when you see the pictures of it spread out. As in those Lycormas, you see them spread out. They look very moth-like. And then sometimes just other, like box elder bugs, they're red and they're black, and people just see that and think that. So yeah, I kind of already showed this slide. So that's all I have for this part of it. Also want to look, so black walnut looks very similar, and I don't see any around here that we can look at, but with Tree of Heaven, all the leaflets on here have little knobs at the base of the leaflet, one knob on each side, and so that's another really easy characteristic that only Tree of Heaven had. They produce both male and female trees. The only way to really know whether or not it's a male or female tree is to look at whether or not it's producing seeds. So females will produce seeds and flowers, males will not. So the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is targeting female trees for removal. That way they're not putting seed out there and then leaving male trees to be those trap trees treated with insecticides. However, Tree of Heaven also reproduces under the ground, so they'll send up new shoots of Tree of Heaven. So if you look at this, this is probably all one Tree of Heaven.
Whoa. So there's like a nursery tree, right?
Right. And it could be that there's a female tree in here, or it could be that there's a male tree in here that's just active and producing other Tree of Heaven. So what you'll see is that if you apply herbicide to some of these, depending on the herbicide, you also will see kill elsewhere. So that's why you have to be really careful if you are going to go in and treat. Make sure that you're treating a different tree than what you put herbicide on, so that those aren't related and you don't end up killing the tree that you wanted to use as a trap tree.
What you just said about using the male trees for trap tree too, is you're really mitigating the potential harm to pollinators that way as well.
Yep, definitely, yeah. So anyway, so yeah, they have those two knobs, and then they also have a really long leaflet, longer than most others, and then they have a really thick base where they connect to the stem. And then you'll also see the leaf scar. If you want to come take a look at these, the leaf scar is very big compared to what it is on black walnut and sumac. And then my favorite way to tell a tree of heaven, Art said these didn't smell very strong, but usually you crush the leaf and you smell it and it'll smell like rancid peanut butter.
Right, this is the trap, the sticky trap they call it. And then these are tree tags that the DEC gave us. And what the idea is you put that around the tree and you tag it with this, just like the emerald ash borer and the Asian longhorn beetle tree tags, if any of you are familiar with that. So they handed out these kits to, I don't even know how many they gave each prism, but all the 8 prisms across the state are going to be using them. So I believe that you have to, the DBH of the tree has to be at least 6 inches.
6 inches, I think, is what they're using. I mean, it's honestly just to make it easier because you can't really wrap these other trees. And then we're also seeing that, you know, spotted lanternfly, if it was in New York, it would be feeding on all of this. So they don't discriminate on size of tree. They like them all in terms of tree of heaven. But it's better just to use a bigger tree because then you can actually wrap it around and get it tight to the tree. So part of the reason that a tree of heaven works to wrap is that with this tree, you know, you've got really irregular bark. The problem with that is that the nymphs will just go right under that. So it's hard to use this as a demo, but you really want to, I'll start unraveling it here. You really want to keep it tight to the tree as much as you can.
And that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Some kind of
and then you can kind of stick it on itself. And then...
Is it on there?
Yep. And then you can start that cut. So in the case that you think it's not tight enough to the tree or it's going to fall down, you can use push pins to secure it and make sure that it's tight to the tree. And then those tags, I think, are mostly just for information. So people are like, what is this weird sticky band and things like that. So you can put those tags on, especially if you're in parks and things like that you'll see people at.
Yeah, and these are like fabric. I mean, I'll pass it around. It feels like it's almost like biodegradable, you know, so it's okay for the environment.
So Heather, you said, I mean, this would, in reality, that would be totally ineffective because that the way that bark is, you would miss most of it.
I would think so. I mean, it would catch some, but yeah, they can just go on up through the cracks here. So that's why you want to make sure you have a smooth bark. I don't see a tree of heaven that's big enough to show you what the bark looks like when they're larger. But another important ID characteristic of tree of heaven is that they have this kind of cantaloupe bark. So the outside of a cantaloupe, you know how that kind of looks. They have a bark that looks really similar to that. So it is ridgy, but not like this. So it doesn't have these deep grooves that a spotted lanternfly can get underneath. And when you're in an area that's infested, usually my experience has been that they'll be raining down on you because they're falling from above because they're just not holding on, or they're launching themselves into the wind. And you'll see them kind of all throughout the grass and then start to crawl up the tree. They don't usually crawl down. So when you look at these bands, most of the spotted lanternfly are on the bottom portion of the band, not the top.
So the egg sac is generally not at the bottom of a tree. It can be anywhere on the tree.
It can be anywhere on the tree, yep.
But the nymphs are going to go up.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you tell people to scrape egg masses, they can do what they can to, you know, a reasonable height, but then, you know, who knows what's up there. So that's not, you know, just scraping egg masses alone isn't gonna cut it.
Would you speak to what you're doing with the citizen scientists with both banding and reporting in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so PDA has a volunteer banding program for folks within the quarantine zone. Really, we're using that as a monitoring tool to understand where infestation is really bad and where we should probably target our trap tree. And so that's great, and what it is volunteers will get free bands and then they have to count them. We are working on somebody to do, working with a researcher to look at an automated band counting, so you can cut it, take a picture of it, and then it will count how many nymphs are on that band. And so that's exciting, but we don't have that finished yet. So the volunteers count the band, they type in, you know, where the location is, and then we have this database of where we have really high infestations. For researchers, that's also been really helpful because we know where to go and collect a lot of nymphs, so that's been helpful there. And we're also developing an app for spotted lanternfly, so it's very similar to other invasive species apps like iPipe, where you can go in and track spotted lanternfly, and it actually will connect you to the reporting site. So that's not out yet, but it will be soon, within the next few weeks is what I'm told.
Yeah, and the DEC said in that draft that they'd written up that you should monitor it every 2 weeks. Now you're saying every week.
It kind of depends. So with homeowners, I usually say every week. Most people are doing it in their backyard anyway, and they're worried about this non-target capture, right. And so I say every week because, and if you're using duct tape, it really should be more often than that because it's so sticky that you're just, especially if you only wrap a couple of bands, it's not as wide, and so you're just kind of filling that up with spotted lanternfly, and then it's just not effective because they're just walking over the dead bodies at that point.
Contact paper.
Yeah.
Do you think that's sticky enough?
I think so. I mean, that's very similar to fly paper. Again, the older the nymphs get, their tarsi change as they age and they get stronger. They're able to grip onto things more often. So you walk out and you're going to get rained on by a lot of first instars, but not as many fourth instars because they're able to hold on a little bit more.
Yeah, I saw the hooks on there.
Yeah, so they have hooks on their tarsi that allow them to grip. And so with this paper, this will get all the instars and it will get some adults as well. Adults we're actually seeing avoid this paper. So again, that's why I say that adults aren't really as effective when you're banding a tree. And then from Korean studies, the reason that this is brown, that we're using brown paper, is that some research in Korea suggested that this is the most attractive to them compared to, I think, red, green, blue, and white. And so that's what we're using, but we're really seeing that if you use duct tape or yellow fly paper that you'll often get it at hardware stores, that it is also really effective.